Clara Whitman drove her knuckles into that heavy oak door at Carter Creek Ranch so hard her hand bled. She didn't stop knocking. Her mother was burning with fever 12 miles behind her. The landlord was coming Friday. The money was gone. And this door, this one door, was the only thing standing between her family and the street. When it finally swung open, and Nathaniel Carter stood there staring down at her like she was something the wind had dragged in, Clara lifted her chin and said 4 words. "My mother is sick." She paused. "So I came. If you've ever had to fight for the people you love when everything was stacked against you, this story is for you." Subscribe to this channel and follow Clara's story all the way to the end, because I promise you, you will not see what's coming. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The door didn't open right away. It never did for women like Clara Whitman. She stood on the porch of Carter Creek Ranch with the Wyoming summer pressing down on her shoulders like a hand trying to push her into the dirt, and she knocked again. Harder this time. The kind of knock that said she wasn't leaving. The kind of knock that cost her something, because her hand was already raw from gripping the reins for 12 miles on a horse that had no business being ridden that hard in July heat. She had left before the sun came up. She hadn't told anyone she was going. Her mother was lying on a narrow bed in their rented room above the feed store in Millhaven, wrapped in 2 quilts despite the suffocating heat, her face the color of old candle wax. The fever had come on fast. 3 days ago, Evelyn Whitman had still been walking to Carter Creek every morning, still managing the household for Nathaniel Carter, still carrying the only income that kept a roof over both their heads. Then Thursday night, the shaking started. By Friday morning, she couldn't stand without the wall. "You can't go," her mother had said when Clara saddled the mare at 4 in the morning. "You can't not go," Clara had answered. She'd left the water and a half loaf of bread within her mother's reach. She'd told Mrs. Harding next door to check in before noon. She'd counted the coins in the tin on the shelf. Enough for 2 more weeks if they were very careful, maybe 3 if they gave up meat entirely. And then she'd folded her mother's note into her dress pocket, climbed up on an old horse named Duchess, who deserved better than this, and ridden out into the dark. 12 miles. Through scrub grass and dust, and the kind of silence that sits on you like judgment. She had not cried. There was no use in it. When she arrived at Carter Creek Ranch just past 7 in the morning, the full summer heat had already settled in like it owned the place. The ranch was bigger than she remembered from the one time she'd come with her mother 2 years ago. 3 large outbuildings, a long bunkhouse, a cookhouse separate from the main house, 24 horses in the paddock. Men were already moving, hauling feed and water, calling back and forth to each other across the yard. They noticed her immediately. Of course they did. A young woman alone, riding a mare that looked like she needed a good rest and a better meal, pulling up at the gate of one of the most prosperous cattle operations in the territory. One of the hands. A thick-armed man with a sun-weathered face and a grin that had nothing kind in it, walked over slowly and looked up at her the way men sometimes looked at things they considered a mild inconvenience. "You lost, miss?" "No," Clara said. "I need to speak with Mr. Carter." The man's grin widened. He turned and said something to another hand nearby, something low that Clara didn't catch but understood from the laughter that followed it. "Mr. Carter don't take visitors this early," the man said. "Especially not—" He looked her over slowly. "Visitors who ride up looking like they came off the wrong end of a 12-mile mistake." Clara didn't move. "Please tell him Evelyn Whitman's daughter is here." Something shifted in the man's expression. Not respect, not yet, but a flicker of recognition at the name. "Evelyn," he repeated. "My mother. She works here." Clara kept her voice level. "She manages the household. She is ill and cannot come in today. I came to speak with Mr. Carter about the arrangement." The man studied her for a long moment, then turned and walked toward the main house without another word. He didn't tell her to get down. He didn't tell her she could come in. He just walked away and left her sitting on Duchess in the full glare of the morning sun, while 3 other hands found something interesting to look at from a careful distance. Clara got down on her own. She tied Duchess to the post by the gate, smoothed the front of her dress, her best one, which still looked like a woman's best dress from a family without enough money, and walked to the front porch. She did not wait at the like she'd been told to. She walked to the door and she knocked. That was when she'd hit it hard enough to bleed. She was still standing there, hand aching, chin up, when the door finally opened. Nathaniel Carter was not what she had expected. She didn't know exactly what she had expected. Some red-faced man with a big stomach, and the comfortable look of someone who'd never worried about 2 weeks' worth of coins in a tin. That was how wealthy ranch owners looked in her imagination, built from years of watching them pass through Millhaven in their good coats. Nathaniel Carter was none of that. How was tall? Taller than the doorframe comfortably allowed, so that he stood with a slight forward lean that made him seem like he was always in the middle of paying attention to something. Dark hair shot through at the temples with early gray. A jaw that looked like it had been set into permanent decision. He wore a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and had the hands of a man who had not always been wealthy. Rough, capable hands with an old scar running along the base of the right thumb. He looked at her. Not the way the hand at the gate had looked at her. Not sizing up what she was worth or wasn't. Just looked. Waiting. "Mr. Carter," Clara said. "My name is Clara Whitman. My mother is Evelyn Whitman. She has been managing your household for the past 3 years." "I know who your mother is," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Even. "She is ill. She has the fever and she cannot come in. I don't know how long she'll be down. The doctor said it could be several days, could be a week or more. I know that leaves you without someone managing the house, and I know that's a problem." Clara didn't look away from him. "So I came." Nathaniel Carter studied her for a moment with that same waiting expression. "How old are you?" 22. "Have you ever managed a household this size?" "No. But I've managed a household that couldn't afford to make mistakes, which is harder." Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite amusement, not quite surprise. Something that hadn't quite decided what it was yet. "Your mother," he said, "is one of the most capable people I've employed. I wouldn't want to see her position lost to her while she recovers." "Neither would I," Clara said. "That's why I'm standing here." I was quiet for a moment. Behind him, inside the house, she could hear the sounds of a household already running behind. Voices calling about something, a clatter from the kitchen direction. The low tension that buildings take on when the person who keeps everything sorted is suddenly absent. "Come in," he said finally. He stepped back from the door. Clara walked into Carter Creek Ranch holding the envelope with her mother's note and every piece of careful self-control she had left. The inside of the house was large in a way that felt earned rather than displayed. Good furniture, solid, not showy. A long hallway with doors on both sides leading to rooms Clara couldn't yet see. Straight ahead, past a dining room with a table that could seat 12, was the kitchen. And that was where the sound was coming from. 2 women talking over each other at increasing volume about something involving flour and the bread that hadn't been started yet. Nathaniel Carter stopped in the hallway. "Mrs. Poole," he called. A woman appeared from the kitchen doorway. 50s, sharp-eyed, wearing an apron that had seen a serious morning already. "Mr. Carter, the bread." "This is Miss Whitman," he said. "Evelyn's daughter. She'll be helping while her mother recovers." Mrs. Poole looked at Clara the way certain experienced women look at younger women who've shown up somewhere they aren't sure about yet. Not unkindly, but thoroughly. "Can you cook?" Mrs. Poole asked. "Yes." "Not fancy cooking, ranch cooking, for 16 men." "Yes." "Can you manage accounts?" "Yes." Mrs. Poole looked at Nathaniel Carter. "She can try," Mrs. Poole said, which from her tone was apparently as close to welcome as a person got on the first day. Nathaniel Carter looked at Clara. "One condition," he said. "Name it." "Show me what you can do." Clara nodded once. "I will." He turned and went back down the hallway toward what she assumed was his study, and Clara was left standing in the kitchen doorway with Mrs. Poole and the sound of bread that hadn't been started and a full day ahead of her. She took off her traveling jacket. She rolled up her sleeves. "What do we need first?" she asked. Mrs. Poole blinked at her. Then something shifted in the older woman's face, just slightly. "Bread," she said. "And then the men will want dinner at noon, and it's already past 7:30. Then let's start, Clara said. She found the flour, she found the salt, and she got to work. What she discovered in that kitchen in the first 2 hours was not what she had expected. She had expected disorder. A household thrown off by her mother's sudden absence. Maybe some scrambling, maybe some friction. What she found instead was something that went deeper than one missed morning. She found the kind of waste that accumulated slowly, over time, from a system where no one person saw the whole picture. The bread flour, the good flour her mother had likely ordered from the mill house in Laramie, was stored in a bin near a wall that sweated in the summer heat. Half of it was already beginning to go off. Clara moved it without a word and said nothing to Mrs. Poole about it, but she filed it away. The smoked meat hanging in the larder was not sorted by age. The older cuts hung behind the newer ones, which meant the newer ones would get used first and the older ones would eventually be inedible. She rearranged quietly. There was a running list on a slate near the back door that tracked what had been used from the main stores. She looked at it carefully. Then she looked at the actual stores. Then she looked at the list again. The numbers didn't match. Not by a little, by enough. She said nothing about this either. Not yet. She didn't know this house, this ranch, these people. She didn't know whose job it was to keep the list and whose job it was to fill the stores, and whether the gap was from honest disorganization or something else entirely. She was new here, and she was on a trial that could end before noon if she gave anyone a reason to want her gone. So she tucked the information somewhere careful in her mind, and she made the bread. By 10 o'clock, the kitchen smelled like a kitchen was supposed to smell. Mrs. Poole had stopped looking at her sideways and started handing her things without being asked. The other kitchen helper, a young girl named Della, 17 at most, who moved carefully around everyone as though she expected to be corrected at any moment, had visibly relaxed. At noon, Clara served dinner for 16 ranch hands in the long dining room off the cookhouse. She had made something simple: a beef and bean stew with the fresh bread, biscuits on the side, a pan of early summer squash from the kitchen garden. Nothing fancy. Everything hot, everything plentiful, everything seasoned correctly. The men came in from the yard expecting a rough meal from whoever the temporary situation had thrown at them. They went quiet when they sat down. Not politely quiet. Not the quiet of men deciding not to complain. The quiet of men who'd just been given something better than they expected and weren't sure what to do with the feeling. One of them, a lean man with a sun-scored face and the look of someone who'd been working cattle since before Clara was born, looked up from his plate and said, "You make this?" "Yes," Clara said. He nodded slowly. "Your mother teach you?" "She taught me some. The rest I figured out. I went back to eating." Across the room, through the open doorway that connected the cookhouse to the main house hall, Clara caught a glimpse of Nathaniel Carter standing still, watching. He didn't say anything. He just watched. And then he turned and went back to whatever he'd been doing. Clara cleared the table when the men were finished. She washed the dishes alongside Della, who had started talking in the careful way of young women who are deciding whether someone is safe to talk to. "Mrs. Whitman, your mother, she's real particular," Della said, not meaning it as a criticism. "She is," Clara agreed. "I used to get nervous when she'd come check the pantry." Della handed her a wet pot. "She always knew when something was wrong before anyone told her." "She's good at that," Clara said. "Are you like her?" Clara thought about it honestly. "I'm different from her, but I notice things too." After the dishes were done, Clara asked Mrs. Poole where the household account books were kept. Mrs. Poole hesitated. "Those are Mr. Bennett's concern," she said. "He manages the ranch accounts." "I understand. But my mother would have had some record of the household supply orders, the kitchen stores, the linens, the domestic side. I'd like to see those to understand what she's been working from." Mrs. Poole studied her for a moment, then went to a small cabinet near the main house kitchen and produced a thin ledger with a brown cover. Clara took it to the kitchen table and opened it. Her mother's handwriting was neat and familiar. She'd grown up watching those letters form across pages of careful record-keeping. Evelyn Whitman had been meticulous. Every supply order noted, dated, itemized. Every delivery recorded against what was expected. Clara compared what the ledger showed against what she'd seen in the larder that morning. She went very still. The shortfall was not small. Over the course of the past several months, there were regular gaps between what had been ordered and delivered and what was actually in the stores. Small enough that any single instance could be explained. Frequent enough that the pattern was undeniable to anyone who looked at all of it together. Her mother had noted some of the discrepancies with small, careful question marks in the margin. She had flagged it, but nothing had been done. Clara closed the ledger carefully and held it in both hands and thought about what she was looking at. She was a woman who had been here less than one day. She did not know yet who Charles Bennett was or what his authority over this ranch truly meant. She did not know whether what she was seeing pointed at honest error or deliberate theft. She did not know Nathaniel Carter well enough to know how he would receive information like this, or whether bringing it to him immediately was the right move, or the kind of move that got someone sent home before dinner. What she knew was this: her mother had seen it. Her mother had marked it, and nothing had changed. She put the ledger back in the cabinet. She would need to understand more before she said anything, but she would not forget what she had seen. That afternoon, Nathaniel Carter came to the kitchen. He didn't announce it. He just appeared in the doorway the way men with authority in their own houses sometimes do. Not as an intrusion, just as a presence that expected to be accommodated. "Sit down," he said, and then looked mildly surprised at himself, as though the word had come out with more weight than he'd intended. "If you have a moment." Clara set down the cloth she'd been using and sat. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and folded his hands on the surface in the deliberate way of a man who was deciding how to begin something. "The men liked dinner," he said. "I'm glad. Mrs. Poole says you reorganized the larder. Some of it. The storage arrangement was letting things go off faster than necessary." He looked at her. "How long have you been managing a household?" "Since I was 12, Clara said. "My father died when I was 11. After that, my mother and I managed together. She taught me the record side. I mostly handled the practical side. We've been doing it together since then." 10 years, he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Your mother is a good woman," he said. "I hope she recovers quickly." "Thank you. But I want to be honest with you, Miss Whitman. If you're going to be here while she's ill, I need to know I can rely on what you tell me. If something is wrong in this house, I need to hear it from you directly. Not managed around, not softened, directly." Clara looked at him steadily. "That's how I work," she said. He nodded as if that was the answer he'd expected. He stood up. "Then we understand each other," he said, and left. Clara sat alone in the kitchen for a moment. Then she got up and went to find out exactly who Charles Bennett was. She found out before supper. She didn't have to look hard. Charles Bennett managed everything on the ranch that Nathaniel Carter didn't manage himself. The external contracts, the hired hands' pay, the supply orders, the record-keeping that bridged the ranch's operating expenses and its income. He was a man of about 50, well-dressed in the way of men who wanted to appear prosperous without being obvious about it, with careful hands and a way of standing that suggested he was always measuring the room. He came to the kitchen to look at her. That was how it felt. Not to introduce himself, not out of courtesy. To look at her and decide what she represented. "Miss Whitman," he said, "I understand you've come to help while your mother's unwell." "That's right," Clara said. "Your mother is a fine woman, very capable within her area." He paused, letting the emphasis on within land where he intended. "The ranch operates on a fairly complex system. I wouldn't want you to feel overwhelmed." "I appreciate that," Clara said, and said nothing else. He waited to see if she would fill the silence. She didn't. Something moved through his expression, brief and controlled, but she caught it. "If you have any questions about how things run here," he said, "come to me. Not Mr. Carter. He has enough on his hands with the cattle operation. The domestic side is really my concern as well." "Of course," Clara said pleasantly. He left. Clara went back to preparing supper, and she understood now, clearly and completely, what she was dealing with. Charles Bennett had been managing the gap between the supply records and the actual stores. He had been doing it carefully and for long enough that he'd become comfortable with it. And he had just told her, in language that was meant to sound helpful, that she should direct any inconvenient questions to him rather than to the man who owned the ranch. That evening, when she served supper and the kitchen was finally cleaned, and Della had gone home and Mrs. Poole had retired to her room at the back of the house, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil. She wrote down everything she remembered from the ledger. Every number. Every question mark her mother had made in the margin. Every gap between what had been ordered and what was actually there. She didn't know yet when she would use it, but she would not let it go. Duchess was stabled in the ranch barn now. One of the hands had taken her without being asked, which was the first unambiguously kind thing anyone had done since she arrived. Clara had thanked him, and he'd shrugged and said something about her mother always leaving carrots in the barn for the old horses. She thought about her mother in that narrow bed in Millhaven. She thought about the coins in the tin. She thought about what the doctor had said. Several days, could be a week or more. And what a week here, proving herself, might actually change. Then she folded her piece of paper and tucked it into the same pocket as her mother's letter and blew out the kitchen lamp. She had one day behind her. She had a ranch that didn't know yet what she was capable of. She had a man who'd said he needed honesty and seemed like he meant it, and she had a truth sitting in her pocket that was going to come out eventually, one way or another. She was here. She was staying. And Carter Creek Ranch had no idea what was coming. She woke before dawn the second morning because the kitchen at Carter Creek Ranch would not wait for anyone, and she had learned that much from her mother before she could read. Her body ached from the previous day. 12 miles on horseback, followed by 14 hours on her feet in an unfamiliar kitchen. And for one blurred moment between sleeping and waking, she thought she was back in Millhaven. She thought she'd hear her mother's careful footsteps crossing the floor, the familiar sound of water being poured, the smell of the morning fire being coaxed back to life. Then she remembered where she was. She sat up, put her feet on the floor, and got to work. Mrs. Poole found her already at the stove when she came in at 5:30, and the older woman stopped in the doorway with an expression Clara couldn't quite read, something between reluctant approval and a woman who had not yet decided whether to trust what she was seeing. "You don't have to start this early," Mrs. Poole said. "The bread takes time," Clara said. "And I want to check the stores before the men start their morning." Mrs. Poole poured herself a cup of the coffee Clara had already made and sat down at the kitchen table and watched her for a moment. "Your mother always started early too," she said finally. "She taught me that the morning sets everything else." Mrs. Poole wrapped both hands around her cup. "She's going to be all right. Your mother. I've known Evelyn 3 years. She's not the kind of woman who stays down long." Clara didn't answer right away. She turned the bread dough and kept her hands moving, because if she stopped moving, she would think about the narrow bed and the fever and the way her mother's voice had sounded thin and far away the morning she'd left, and she couldn't afford to go to that place right now. Not here. Not in front of anyone. "No," she said. "She's not." The morning moved fast after that. The ranch hands came through the cookhouse at first light, wanting coffee and biscuits, and Clara had both ready and hot, and she watched how the men settled into the day. She was paying attention to everything now, not in an obvious way, not in the way of a woman cataloging a room, but in the quiet, practical way her mother had always worked, taking in information and filing it away. Watching who sat where, who talked to whom, who came in and looked around before they sat down, who didn't look at her at all, which was sometimes more interesting than the ones who did. The lean man from yesterday. She'd learned his name was Walt Greer, the lead ranch hand who'd worked for Nathaniel Carter for 11 years, came in last and poured his own coffee and sat at the end of the table and said nothing to anyone, which appeared to be entirely normal based on the way no one reacted to it. He did look at her once, briefly, when she set the biscuit pan down. "You're still here," he said. "I am," she said. He nodded once and picked up a biscuit. She took that as a passing grade. After breakfast was cleared and Della arrived to start the mid-morning tasks, Clara went back to the larder with the ledger and a fresh piece of paper. She'd been thinking about the numbers since she'd written them down the night before. She'd been turning them over in her mind, the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath it. Because she'd seen enough of her mother's careful question marks in the margins to know that Evelyn Whitman had been looking at the same thing and had not yet found the right moment to say something about it. The gap wasn't random. That was the thing she kept coming back to. If it had been random, different items, different amounts, no pattern, she might have believed in honest disorganization. Ranch houses were complicated. Stores got used faster in some weeks than others. Orders came in wrong sometimes from suppliers who weren't careful, but the pattern was too consistent. It was always the higher value items. Cured meats, good flour, the coffee that cost more than the ordinary kind, the lamp oil, which was tracked loosely because no one expected anyone to care about lamp oil. Someone who knew what they were doing had chosen exactly the items that would be noticed least and missed most slowly. Clara sat with that knowledge for a full 10 minutes before she heard footsteps in the hallway. Not delicate, careful steps. Not Mrs. Poole's purposeful stride. Heavier. Deliberate. Charles Bennett appeared in the larder doorway. He looked at the ledger in her hands and the paper on the shelf beside her, and something happened behind his eyes that he covered very quickly with a pleasant expression. "Miss Whitman," he said. "Early morning inventory?" "I like to know what I'm working with," Clara said. "Of course." He stepped into the larder and looked around in a casual way that was not casual at all. "Your mother kept excellent records. I wouldn't want you to feel like you needed to duplicate her work. I do a full supply audit at the end of each month." "That's useful to know," Clara said. "Is there something specific you're looking for? I might be able to save you the time." She looked at him directly. "I'm just getting familiar with the system," she said. "I find it easier to work from my own notes." He smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that had been used successfully many times. "Very thorough," he said. "You remind me of your mother." He left. Clara waited until his footsteps had faded completely down the hall. Then she picked up her paper and the ledger and walked to the kitchen and put them on the table directly in front of her and looked at them for a long moment, thinking about the way he'd appeared exactly when she was in the larder, and the way his eyes had gone to the ledger before they'd gone to her, and the way the smile hadn't reached anything above the level of his mouth. He was watching her, which meant he already felt watched. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket. The morning pushed on. Around 9 o'clock, a situation developed that nobody had expected. One of the ranch hands came into the kitchen. Young, maybe 19, with the look of someone who'd been working hard all morning and had just received bad news, and said that 2 of the supply wagons that were supposed to come in from Laramie by Friday had been delayed. The driver had sent word from the relay station. Axle trouble. They wouldn't arrive until Monday at the earliest. The hands were supposed to be reshoeing horses Friday afternoon, which meant extra men on the ranch grounds for longer than usual, which meant more mouths to feed for an extra 2 or 3 days on what was already in the house. Mrs. Poole looked at Clara. Clara looked at what was in the larder. She did the math quickly in her head. The kind of math she'd been doing her entire adult life, stretching what you had against what you needed with no room for error. And she set down the cloth she was holding. "We're short on the cured meat for 3 extra days of full meals," she said. "But we've got enough on the root vegetable side, and we have the dried beans. I can make it work if I'm smart about the meat portions. What about the ranchers' wives? Do any of them come in to help when there are extra men on the grounds?" Mrs. Poole blinked. "Sometimes Mrs. Greer does. Walt's wife. She brings bread when she knows it's a long week." "Could we ask her?" "You'd have to ask Walt." Clara untied her apron. She walked out of the cookhouse and across the yard to where Walt Greer was working near the horse paddock, talking to 2 other hands about something she couldn't hear. He saw her coming, and he watched her walk toward him with the patient expression of a man who had learned a long time ago that things came to him when they needed to, and there was no use running toward them or away. "Mr. Greer," she said, "I understand your wife sometimes helps when there are extra men on the property." He looked at her for a moment. "She does. The supply wagons are delayed until Monday. I need to know if I'm feeding the reshoeing crew through the weekend on what's in the larder. Can I ask her to come in?" Walt Greer studied her face with the slow, thorough attention of a man who had spent decades reading weather and cattle and the intentions of people, all of which required the same basic skill. "I'll send my boy to ask her," he said. "But I'll tell you this. Sarah Greer doesn't come in for just anyone. She came in for your mother because your mother treated her like a person and not like a hired hand." Clara held his gaze. "I'll treat her the same way," she said. Walt looked at her for one more moment. Then he turned and called for his boy. Sarah Greer arrived by 10:30 with 2 loaves of bread already baked and a manner that was brisk and cheerful and completely at ease in a kitchen that wasn't hers, which told Clara a great deal about the kind of woman she was. She was around 40, broad-shouldered, with flour on her sleeve that had clearly come from her own house that morning and a quick assessing glance that she gave Clara without trying to hide it. "Evelyn's daughter," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "She talked about you." Clara paused. "Good things, I hope." Sarah Greer set her bread on the table and looked at her with an expression that was surprisingly warm. "She said you were the most stubborn woman she'd ever raised," Sarah said. She meant it as the highest possible compliment. Clara felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight all morning. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Don't thank me yet. What are we working with?" They worked together through the morning in the easy rhythm of 2 women who understood kitchens and deadlines and the particular satisfaction of making something from not quite enough. Sarah knew the ranch, knew the men, knew which hands would eat anything put in front of them, and which ones had specific complaints that were best addressed before they became complaints out loud. She filled Clara in without being asked, the way capable women sometimes share information, not as gossip, but as useful intelligence. "Walt's been here 11 years, Sarah said, rolling dough beside Clara at the long kitchen table. "He's loyal to Mr. Carter like I've never seen. You treat Walt right, you've got a friend for life. You treat him wrong, you'd best be looking for different employment." "He seems fair," Clara said. "He is, fair and hard, which is the good combination." Sarah paused, pressing the dough. "Bennett's the one to watch." Clara kept her hands moving. "Oh?" she said, in the careful tone of someone who hadn't already spent 2 days watching exactly that. "He's been here 4 years, Sarah said. Walt doesn't like him. Walt doesn't say that out loud. Walt doesn't say much out loud about anything. But I can read my husband, and I know." "Something about the accounts," Walt said once. And then he stopped talking about it. Clara set down her rolling pin. "Something about the accounts," she repeated. "That's all he said. I pushed and he went quiet, which means he'd said more than he intended." Sarah glanced at her sideways. "Your mother sent a letter to someone in Laramie about 2 months ago. She asked me to help her address the envelope. She didn't tell me what was in it." Clara was completely still. "Who in Laramie?" she said. "The Territorial Land Office." Sarah said it simply, watching for Clara's reaction. "I don't know why. She didn't say. But she asked me not to mention it to anyone at the ranch, and I haven't, not in 2 months. I'm mentioning it to you because you're her daughter, and because I think you're already looking at the same things she was looking at." Clara picked up the rolling pin again. Her hands were steady. Her mind was not. Her mother had written to the Territorial Land Office, not to a magistrate, not to a local authority who might know Bennett personally or owe him some courtesy. To the Land Office, the governmental body that oversaw major land and property disputes in the territory. Why the Land Office? Clara turned that question over and over while she cooked, and while she portioned, and while she talked to Sarah about ordinary things that didn't matter, and while she served the midday meal to 16 ranch hands who were starting to come in without the wary looks they'd given her the day before, replacing them with something closer to expectation. The comfortable expectation of men who were beginning to assume that what they'd gotten yesterday was what they were going to get today, which was, she understood, the highest form of endorsement available in this particular world. The meal was good. She made it good deliberately, because she was thinking hard, and cooking was the thing she could do perfectly on instinct while her mind worked elsewhere. When the kitchen was cleared after noon, Nathaniel Carter appeared again. He had a way of doing that. Appearing without warning, without announcement, in doorways or hallways, in the quiet spaces between events. She'd noticed it was not surveillance. It was something closer to the habit of a man who was always paying attention to his property, always gauging the temperature of the various systems that kept Carter Creek running. She was one of those systems now, at least temporarily, and she was being gauged. "Sit down," he said, and this time caught himself before the word landed too hard and added, more evenly, "If you have a moment." She sat. He sat across from her. "Sarah Greer came in," he said. "The supply wagons are delayed. I needed an extra pair of hands." "You went to Walt directly." "He's the one who would know whether she'd come." Nathaniel looked at her with the considering expression she was starting to recognize as his default mode. Not skepticism, not warmth, but the focused attention of someone taking careful stock of information. "Walt doesn't usually cooperate with new people easily," he said. "He cooperated because it was a practical request, and I made it practically," Clara said. "I wasn't asking him for a favor. I was asking him to help solve a problem for the ranch." "There's a difference. There always is." He was quiet for a moment. "What else have you noticed?" he said. The question was direct enough that it surprised her. Not the question itself, but the way he asked it. Not "what do you think of the kitchen?" or "how are you finding the work?" "What else have you noticed?" As if he already knew she'd noticed something and was waiting to see whether she'd say so. She thought about Charles Bennett appearing in the larder that morning. She thought about her mother's letter to the land office. She thought about being here 2 days, working on trial, with no standing to make accusations that a man who'd been in this house for 4 years could easily attribute to the inexperienced daughter of an absent woman trying to justify her own presence. She thought about what Nathaniel Carter had said yesterday evening, sitting at this same table. "If something is wrong in this house, I need to hear it from you directly. Your supply records and your actual stores don't match," she said. "I noticed it yesterday. I've been looking more carefully today. The gap is consistent and it's specific to higher value items. It's not random shortfall. It's too deliberate for that." Nathaniel didn't move. He sat exactly as he had been sitting, hands folded on the table, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "How large a gap?" he said. "Over the past several months? Significant. I can write the numbers down for you if you want them." "I want them." "I'll have them for you this evening." Clara held his gaze. "I want to be clear about something. I don't know yet where the shortfall is going. I know the pattern of what's missing. I know when it started roughly, based on my mother's records. I'm not in a position to name anyone based on what I have right now." "But you have a suspicion." "I have an observation," she said carefully. "I think you should look at the full accounts yourself, not through whoever currently manages them. Yourself, directly." He was very still. "Why directly?" he said. "Because if I'm right about the pattern, then whoever is managing those accounts has had plenty of time to make sure they look correct to a casual review. You'd need to look at the originals against the actual supply deliveries, the driver receipts, the itemized orders versus what came in." Nathaniel sat back in his chair. He looked at her for a long moment. The kind of long moment that sits heavy in a room and means a decision is being made behind it. "My mother flagged this too," Clara said quietly. She left question marks in her ledger. She'd been seeing the same thing. Something shifted in his face. "Evelyn never said anything to me," he said. "I know." Clara paused. She was afraid of being wrong. She'd been in service long enough to know what happens to a woman in her position who makes an accusation she can't fully prove. The silence that followed that statement had weight to it. Nathaniel Carter looked at the table. Then he looked at Clara. "You're not afraid of being wrong?" he said. "I'm not making an accusation," she said. "I'm telling you to look at your own books. That's different." He stood up. He walked to the doorway and stopped there with his back to her for a moment, and she had the impression of a man doing rapid, private recalculation. The kind that happens when something you suspected but hadn't fully admitted to yourself gets confirmed by someone else saying it aloud. He turned around. "The numbers," he said. "Have them for me this evening." "Yes," she said. He left. Clara sat alone at the kitchen table. She was aware that she had just done something that could not be undone. She had named the problem to the man who owned this ranch, and she had done it without enough evidence to be certain, and she had done it on the basis of 2 days of observation, and her mother's careful question marks, and the letter to a land office she hadn't even known about until this morning. But she had also done it because Nathaniel Carter had looked her in the eye and asked her directly what she'd noticed. And there was only one kind of woman she knew how to be. The afternoon passed in hard work and sharp focus. She cooked with Sarah Greer and talked about ordinary things and laughed twice at things that were genuinely funny. And she made sure the kitchen was in perfect order before Sarah left to go home to her own family. She made sure Della got her tasks done and felt good about having done them. She made sure the bread for tomorrow was started. And at 5 o'clock, when the kitchen was clean and the evening meal was set and Della had gone home, Clara sat at the kitchen table with her paper and her pencil, and she wrote out every number she had. She wrote clearly and completely, the way her mother had taught her to write records. Because a record that couldn't be understood by someone else was only half a record. She listed each category of item. The amounts ordered. The amounts recorded as received. The amounts actually present in the stores. The dates when the gaps appeared. The pattern across those dates. When she was done, she read it back to herself once. Then she folded the paper and went to find Nathaniel Carter. He was in his study, a room she hadn't been in before, where she knocked on the half-open door and waited. He looked up from a ledger he'd already pulled out, which told her he hadn't waited for her numbers before starting to look himself. She set her paper on the desk in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything, and the longer he was silent, the more Clara understood that he was not reading things he didn't recognize. He was reading things that confirmed what he'd already half known and hadn't wanted to fully know. The dates, he said. These are consistent. Yes. The items. Yes. It's not random. He set the paper down and put both hands flat on the desk and stared at the surface of it with an expression that was controlled fury, doing its best to stay controlled. "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" he said. His voice was very even. "All my life," she said. "When you don't have enough, you learn to track everything. You can't afford not to." He looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd knocked on the door of Carter Creek Ranch with a bleeding hand and 4 words, Clara saw something in Nathaniel Carter's face that wasn't assessment, wasn't patience, wasn't the careful reserve of a man holding the world at arm's length. It was recognition. The particular recognition of someone who has spent years watching careful, capable work go unseen and unacknowledged, and has just watched it happen in front of him again, and is deciding what to do about that. "Thank you," he said, simply, like the words meant something specific. "I'll check the remaining stores tomorrow," she said, "if you want the complete picture before you look at the full accounts." "I do." "Then I'll have it." She left. She walked back down the hallway to the kitchen and stood alone in the clean, quiet room for a moment with the sound of the ranch settling into evening around her and the paper she'd carried in her pocket all day, now sitting on a desk in a man's study who was going to have to decide what to do with the truth she'd just handed him. She had come to Carter Creek Ranch carrying her mother's letter and 10 years of experience and very little else. She had not come to expose anyone. She had not come to make herself important. She had come because her mother was sick and the job needed doing, and she was the only one there was. But the truth had a way of making itself known to the people who were willing to look at it, and Clara Whitman had always been willing to look. The evening went quietly, almost too quietly. She served supper. The men ate. Walt Greer, on his way out, paused in the doorway and said, without looking back at her, "Sarah said you were worth your salt." "Tell her thank you," Clara said. He made a sound that was approximately a grunt of acknowledgement and left. She was washing the last of the supper dishes when she heard raised voices from somewhere in the direction of the main house. Not loud enough to make out words, but the distinct shape of a difficult conversation happening behind closed walls. Della had already gone home. Mrs. Poole had retired. Clara dried her hands and stood still and listened. The voices stopped. Then a door closed, sharply. Then silence. She finished the dishes. She banked the kitchen fire and set the coffee ready for the morning. She went to the small room at the back of the cookhouse, where Mrs. Poole had put a cot for her to sleep on, and she sat on the edge of it and took her mother's letter from her pocket and read it, though she already knew every word. Her mother had written, "Tell them you can do the work. Don't ask. Show them." Clara folded the letter and put it back. She lay down on the cot and looked at the ceiling of Carter Creek Ranch in the dark. From somewhere across the yard, behind the closed walls of the main house, she thought she heard one more sound. Something like a drawer being pulled open, and then papers, and then the particular silence of a man alone in a room with a truth he'd been avoiding sitting down to look at. And she understood, with absolute certainty, that whatever came next, whatever Charles Bennett said or did when he realized she hadn't been warned off, whatever Nathaniel Carter found when he looked at those accounts with fresh eyes, whatever the land office in Laramie had started moving on the basis of her mother's letter 2 months ago, the ranch was about to change. She had come here to save her mother's job. But something considerably larger was already in motion. She woke the third morning to the sound of someone moving fast in the main house. Not the ordinary sounds of a ranch waking up. The slow build of boots on floors and horses shifting in the barn and the first fire of the morning taking hold. This was different. Sharp footsteps crossing a room more than once. A door opening, closing. The particular tension of a building where something had happened in the night and the walls were still carrying it. Clara was dressed and in the kitchen before 5. Mrs. Poole arrived 8 minutes later, which was 12 minutes earlier than usual, which told Clara the older woman had heard it too. Neither of them said anything about it. They made coffee and got the bread started and worked in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but was very alert. And at 5:30, Walt Greer came into the cookhouse and poured himself coffee, and stood at the far end of the kitchen with the expression of a man who had already been up for an hour and had already been told something he didn't like. He looked at Clara once. She looked back at him. "Everything all right, Mr. Greer?" she said. "Depends on your definition," he said, and drank his coffee and said nothing else. She didn't push. She turned back to the bread and kept her hands moving and her ears open, and by the time the morning meal was ready, she had pieced together enough from the sounds of the house, and the particular silence from the direction of the study, and the way the ranch hands came in to breakfast, with the careful quiet of men who sensed a storm building, to understand that whatever Nathaniel Carter had found when he looked at those accounts last night had been enough. It had been more than enough. She was clearing the breakfast table when Nathaniel Carter appeared in the cookhouse doorway. He didn't come in. He stood at the threshold the way he sometimes did, and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the cool assessment of the first 2 days. Not the careful consideration of a man taking stock. This was something rawer. Something that had spent the night sitting with something ugly, and was still deciding what to do with the feeling. "Miss Whitman," he said, "when you're finished." She set down the stack of plates. "I'm finished now," she said. She followed him down the hall to his study, and he closed the door behind them, and she saw the desk. It looked like a man had gone to war with it. The ledgers were spread open. Not just the household account she'd looked at, but 4 others, the large ones that tracked the full ranch operation. Papers were stacked and restacked in the way of someone who had been comparing things all night, pulling numbers and laying them against other numbers and pulling them again. The lamp had burned down to almost nothing. There was a coffee cup that had been empty for hours. He had not slept. He sat down in the chair behind the desk and looked at the mess of it, and then looked at her. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "How much of this did you know before last night?" he said. "I knew the household side," she said. "The supply shortfall in the kitchen stores. I didn't know what was in the ranch accounts. I haven't seen those before now. The household side is the smallest part," he said. His voice was level, but underneath the level was something like fury that had been walked in very tight circles all night long. "The supply shortfall you found in the larder, that's the tip of it. The actual accounts." He stopped, put his hand on one of the open ledgers. "Do you know what land fraud is, Miss Whitman?" Clara went very still. "I know what it means," she said carefully. "There are 3 parcels of land adjacent to this ranch," Nathaniel said. "I've been purchasing them gradually over the past 2 years, or I believed I was purchasing them. He turned one of the ledgers toward her and pointed to a column of figures. These are the payments I authorized. This is what my accounts show as paid to the sellers. She looked. This, he said, turning a second document, is what I found when I compared against the actual deed transfers on record. The gap between what left this ranch and what the sellers actually received. Clara looked at the second set of numbers. The gap was not small. It was not the careful, incremental skimming she'd identified in the household stores. This was systematic, significant. The kind of number that didn't happen by accident and didn't happen quickly. This had been built over 2 years, transaction by transaction, in amounts large enough to matter and structured carefully enough that each individual instance could be attributed to timing, to transfer fees, to the natural friction of land transactions in a territory where documentation wasn't always immediate, to anyone who wasn't looking at all of it together. The land office in Laramie, Clara said. She said it quietly, testing the shape of it. Nathaniel Carter looked at her sharply. What do you know about the land office? My mother wrote to them 2 months ago, Clara said. I found out yesterday. I don't know exactly what she said, but she asked a woman she trusted to help her address the envelope, and she asked that woman not to tell anyone at the ranch. I think she had found some version of what you're looking at now, and she didn't know what to do with it. She didn't have access to the full accounts. She only had what she could see from the household side. The silence that followed was the kind that changes the temperature of a room. Nathaniel Carter sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Evelyn, he said quietly, not as an accusation, almost as an acknowledgement, of a woman who had done the right careful thing in the only way available to her. She couldn't come to you directly, Clara said. She didn't have enough, and she was afraid that without enough, she'd be the one removed from the equation. She was right to be afraid, Nathaniel said, because the man who's been managing these accounts has been here 4 years, has references from 2 other major ranch operations, and has made himself very comfortable in the position of being the person I relied on to tell me what was happening with my own money. He stopped. He looked at the desk. I trusted him, he said. The 3 words landed flat and hard, the way honest statements sometimes do when they cost something to say. I was careful, Clara said. He was careful enough that your mother, one of the sharpest women in this territory when it comes to household accounts, couldn't get enough to prove it. She could only point in the direction and hope someone followed the line. You followed the line, he said. I came here to save my mother's job, Clara said. The line was already there to follow. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I need to go to Laramie. Yes, she said. I need to do it before Bennett realizes how much I've found. If he knows I'm looking. He already knows I've been looking, Clara said. He came to the larder yesterday morning when I was reviewing the household ledger. He saw what I had. He knows I gave you something last night. Nathaniel was on his feet before she finished the sentence. He moved to the door and opened it and said, with the controlled quiet of a man who had decided something, Walt. Walt Greer materialized from the direction of the yard with the speed of someone who had been expecting to be called. Get the bay horse ready, Nathaniel said, and find Bennett. Tell him I want to see him in the main room in 20 minutes. Don't tell him why. Walt's jaw was set in the hard line of a man who had been waiting a long time to be given a reason to do exactly that. Yes, sir, he said, and went. Nathaniel turned back to Clara. Stay in the kitchen, he said. Not because I'm sending you away, because I need the house to look normal, and the kitchen is what normal looks like on this ranch right now. Understood, she said. And Miss Whitman. She stopped. What you found, he said. What you were willing to say out loud, that took something. It took looking, she said. That's all. She went back to the kitchen. She told herself she was calm. She was mostly lying. Mrs. Poole was at this kitchen table when Clara came back, hands wrapped around her coffee cup, with the expression of a woman who had worked on this ranch long enough to read its weather and knew a serious front was moving in. What's happening? Mrs. Poole said. Mr. Carter is handling something, Clara said. He asked that we keep things normal. Mrs. Poole looked at her steadily. You told him, she said. not a question. "I told him what I found," Clara said. "He found the rest himself." The older woman was quiet for a moment. "Bennett's going to say it was you," Mrs. Poole said. "When he gets his back up, he's going to say you made it up, that you came in here with your mother's position at stake, and you invented something to make yourself seem valuable." Clara poured herself coffee and sat down. "I know," she said, "and you did it anyway. My mother flagged the same problem 2 months ago and sent a letter to the land office," Clara said. "I'm not the source. I'm the second person to find what was already there." Mrs. Poole blinked. Then something moved across the older woman's face. Something that was, if Clara was reading it correctly, the particular relief of someone who had known something wasn't right for a long time, and had not known how to say so. "I knew the bread flour was going off too fast," Mrs. Poole said quietly. "I knew the meat wasn't lasting. I thought I was being careless. I thought I was getting old and losing track." "You weren't," Clara said. "The stores were being restocked short of what was ordered. The numbers coming in didn't match what was actually being delivered. It was designed to look like household waste." Mrs. Poole set her cup down. 4 years, she said. "Yes." The older woman looked at the table surface for a moment. "I should have said something," she said. "You didn't have the numbers," Clara said. "My mother did, and it still took her months to feel she had enough. This isn't on you." Mrs. Poole looked up at her, and Clara saw, for the first time, something in the older woman's face that had not been there on day one. Not the measured approval of a woman deciding whether to trust a newcomer, but something warmer, something that had decided. "Your mother raised you right," Mrs. Poole said. The raised voices started 20 minutes later. They came from the direction of the main room. Not screaming, not the ugly volume of men who'd abandoned control, but the distinct elevated tension of a confrontation that both parties were trying to keep inside the walls of a room while both parties were failing to do so entirely. Clara kept working. She started the midday meal because the midday meal needed doing, and the men would be hungry, regardless of what was happening in the main room, and standing still and listening was not going to make anything better or worse. She was rolling biscuit dough when she heard Bennett's voice cut through a lower register, clear enough to make out words through the wall between the cookhouse and the house. "The girl has been here 3 days." Nathaniel's answer was lower, controlled, impossible to decipher from this distance. Then Bennett again, sharper. "Her mother never said a word in 3 years, and now suddenly—" Then nothing for a long moment. Then a sound that was a chair moving. Then boots. Then the front door of the main house opened, and she heard Charles Bennett cross the porch and go down the steps, and she heard his voice outside now. Lower, because he'd realized the volume. Saying something to someone she couldn't identify. She kept rolling dough. Della arrived at 10, took one look at the kitchen, took another look at Clara's face, and quietly began doing exactly what needed doing without asking a single question, which was the most useful thing anyone had done all morning. Walt Greer came to the cookhouse door at 10:30. "Mr. Carter wants to know if you can have the books ready to travel," he said. "Which books?" "The household ledger, your notes, whatever you put together for him last night." "Yes," Clara said. 20 minutes. Walt turned to go. "Mr. Greer," Clara said. He stopped. "Did Bennett leave the property?" Walt's jaw moved once. "He's in the bunkhouse. Mr. Carter told him to stay until this is resolved. Bennett's not happy about it." A pause. "Bennett can be unhappy about it all he likes." He left. Clara wiped her hands and went to the small cabinet where she'd put her notes and the household ledger, and she organized everything in the careful, logical order of someone who knew that documents told their story best when they were arranged, so that the story was obvious to someone who hadn't been living inside it. She thought about what Mrs. Poole had said. "He's going to say it was you." He probably was. He probably already had said something close to it in the main room. And the truth was that she was a woman who had been here 3 days, working on an informal trial arrangement, with a sick mother whose job was under threat, which gave her a motive, in the eyes of anyone who wanted to see one, for making herself seem indispensable, for finding problems that would make her necessary. The fact that the problems were real did not automatically erase the appearance of that motive. She knew that. She had known it when she decided to speak. She had spoken anyway. When she brought the documents to the study, Nathaniel Carter was at the desk, and he had another set of papers in front of him that she hadn't seen before. Correspondence, from the look of it, several letters with official headings. He looked up. "The land office in Laramie responded to your mother's letter," he said. Clara went very still. "When?" "The letter arrived 3 weeks ago," he said. "It went to Bennett first, because he manages all incoming correspondence." His voice had the particular flatness of a man recounting something that made him very angry in a way he was refusing to express right now. "He held it." "He held it," Clara repeated. "I found it in the correspondence file this morning when I was looking for something else. It was filed under routine correspondence, supplier records." He turned the letter toward her. Clara read it. The land office in Laramie had received Evelyn Whitman's letter and had assigned an investigator to look into the land transaction records for Carter Creek Ranch. The letter was careful and official and said what government letters always said, that the matter was being reviewed, that documentation would be requested, that the property holder should be prepared to present original deeds and payment records for verification. It was addressed to Nathaniel Carter. It had been sitting in a file for 3 weeks, because the man it implicated had been the one to receive it. "He knew," Clara said. "He's known for 3 weeks that an investigation was coming," Nathaniel said. "Which means for 3 weeks he's had the opportunity to—" He stopped. "To clean the records," Clara said. "Yes." They looked at each other. "We need to go to Laramie," Clara said, "today, before he has any more time." "I know. And you need to bring the originals, everything. Not copies, the original ledgers, the original deed paperwork, the payment records from the sellers. If he's had 3 weeks, he may have already altered copies, but altering the originals is harder because the physical paper—" "I know," Nathaniel said. He looked at her with something direct and serious. "Can you run this house while I'm gone?" "Yes." "I don't know how long, 2 days, could be 3. I can run it for as long as you need," she said. "But you need to go now." He stood. He was already in his coat. "Walt will stay," he said. "If Bennett causes any trouble." "Walt will handle it," Clara said. "And if Walt needs backup, Mrs. Poole is more than capable." The corner of his mouth moved, just once. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the shape of one. "Yes," he said. "She is." He picked up the stack of documents she'd organized. He looked at them for a moment. "Miss Whitman," he said, "what your mother started, and what you finished, this is going to matter. For this ranch, and for the people on it." Clara lifted her chin. "Go," she said, "before he figures out you're leaving." He went. She heard the bay horse leave the yard 15 minutes later, moving fast. The day that followed was the longest Clara had spent at Carter Creek Ranch. Not because it was eventful, because it was the opposite. Charles Bennett knew that Nathaniel was gone. He had to know. The bay horse leaving, the packed documents, the direction Nathaniel had ridden. He was not a stupid man. He had been careful and deliberate for 4 years, and he understood perfectly well what it meant when the man who owned the ranch rode toward Laramie the morning after being given evidence of fraud. He came to the cookhouse at noon. Clara was serving the midday meal, and she heard him come in behind her, and she kept serving, kept moving, kept her back straight, and her face arranged in the ordinary expression of a woman doing her job, which was the most important performance of her life. "Miss Whitman," he said. She turned. He looked different from the day before. Still controlled, still careful, but the ease had left him. The comfortable authority of a man in his own territory. He looked like a man doing rapid calculations and not entirely liking the results. "Mr. Carter had to ride to Laramie on business," she said pleasantly. "He asked me to make sure operations ran smoothly while he's away." "I'm aware of that," Bennett said. The ranch hands at the table were very quiet. They were eating, all of them, looking at their plates, but every pair of ears in the room was pointed at this conversation. "Is there something I can help you with?" Clara said. "I'd like to look at the household ledger," he said. "The one your mother kept." "That's with Mr. Carter," she said. "He took it with him." Something flickered behind Bennett's eyes. "I see," he said. "If you need something from the household records, I'm happy to help when he returns." He looked at her for a moment. "You're very composed for someone who's been here 3 days," he said. "I've had a lot of practice," Clara said. He left. Walt Greer, who had been eating at the end of the table and had not looked up once during the entire exchange, waited until the cookhouse door was fully closed. Then he looked up. He looked at Clara. She looked back at him. "You're doing fine," he said quietly, and went back to his meal. It was the closest thing to a declaration of loyalty she was going to get from Walt Greer, and she understood that perfectly, and she held on to it like the serious currency it was. The afternoon turned difficult in a way she hadn't anticipated. It came not from Bennett, but from the ranch itself. From the particular fragility of a large operation when the person holding the authority is absent, and everyone can feel the gap. 3 of the younger ranch hands got into a dispute about work assignments that turned louder than it should have. A delivery of fencing supplies arrived, and the driver had the wrong paperwork, and no one could find the original order. One of the horses in the east paddock had gone lame in the night, and the decision about the farrier needed to be made. None of these were Clara's domain. All of them ended up at her kitchen door anyway. The first time it happened, the young hands appearing at the cookhouse with their dispute, looking past her for someone with authority and finding only her. She considered sending them to Walt. Then she considered what sending them to Walt said about what kind of person she was in this house. "Stop," she said. "Both of you." They stopped. "Tell me what happened. One at a time. You first." She listened to both sides with the complete, focused attention of a woman who had mediated every kind of domestic and practical conflict that arose in a struggling household for 10 years, which turned out to be adequate preparation for mediating the conflicts that arose in a struggling ranch, because people were people, and disputes were disputes, and the underlying arithmetic of who was responsible for what was always solvable if you were willing to think clearly about it. She gave them a solution. It was fair. They both knew it was fair, which was why neither of them argued. They left. The delivery driver was next, and she solved his paperwork problem by finding the original order copy that her mother had noted in the household records. Not the fencing supplies directly, but a cross-referenced note that pointed her toward the right file in a cabinet she hadn't opened yet. Her mother had been thorough in ways that kept paying forward. The horse question she took to Walt, because that was genuinely his domain, and she wasn't going to step into it. But she went to Walt and said clearly what needed deciding, and he made the decision in 30 seconds and thanked her for flagging it. By the time evening came, the ranch was intact. By the time she banked the kitchen fire, she was exhausted in a way that went down to the bone. She was sitting on the edge of her cot, too tired to take off her second boot, when Mrs. Poole knocked on the frame of the open door and came in and set a plate of food on the small table beside her. "You didn't eat this afternoon," Mrs. Poole said. "I meant to. You fed 16 men and solved 4 different problems, and you didn't eat." Mrs. Poole stood with her arms crossed, but her expression was not unkind. "Eat." Clara ate. Mrs. Poole sat in this chair by the door and watched her with the manner of a woman who has something she wants to say and is deciding how to say it. "I've been on this ranch 7 years, Mrs. Poole said finally. "I've seen 3 managers come through before Bennett. One good, one indifferent, one who drank too much. I've seen hired hands who were worth their salt and hired hands who weren't. I've seen Mr. Carter make good decisions and a few that cost him." She paused. "I've never seen anything like what's happened this week." 3 days, Clara said. "It's only been 3 days. I know how long it's been." Mrs. Poole looked at her directly. "That's what I mean." Clara set down the fork. "My mother saw the same things I saw," she said. "She saw them first." "Your mother saw them and didn't know how to bring them forward without losing everything," Mrs. Poole said. "You saw them and brought them forward anyway. That's a different thing." Clara thought about the night she'd written down the numbers. The moment she'd sat across from Nathaniel Carter and said the words out loud. The knowledge that she was new here, that she had a motive that could be used against her, that she was alone in a house full of people who didn't owe her anything. "I didn't have as much to lose," she said. "Everyone has something to lose," Mrs. Poole said. Not everyone acts anyway. She stood up. Sleep, she said. Tomorrow we'll need you. She left. Clara sat alone with the empty plate, and the darkness, and the sound of Carter Creek Ranch settling into the night. Tomorrow would come. Bennett was still here, somewhere in the bunkhouse, sitting with his calculations, and whatever plan a careful man made when the walls started closing in. Nathaniel Carter was in Laramie, or riding toward it, with a packet of documents and a truth that was about to become official. Her mother was in Millhaven, hopefully with the fever beginning to break, in the room above the feed store with the coins in the tin. And Clara Whitman was lying on a cot in the back of a ranch cookhouse, too tired to think straight and too awake to sleep, understanding with complete clarity that the 3 days behind her had changed the shape of something. She didn't know yet what shape it had taken, but she knew she had not come this far to stop now. She took off the second boot. She lay down. And in the morning, everything would be different. She just didn't know yet how different. She woke on the fourth morning to silence. Not the ordinary silence of early morning before the ranch came to life. Something different. The kind of silence that has a texture to it. The absence of something that should be there. Clara was dressed and in the kitchen in 4 minutes. Mrs. Poole was already at the stove, and she turned when Clara came in with an expression that said she'd been awake for a while and had been waiting for someone else to be awake too. "Bennett's gone," Mrs. Poole said. Clara stopped. "When?" "Before light. Walt found his bunkhouse empty at 4. His horses gone. His personal effects, the things from his office, most of them are gone too." Clara stood very still and thought through what that meant. A man who ran in the night was a man who had decided the calculation no longer worked in his favor, which meant he'd had enough time to think through what Nathaniel was going to find in Laramie. The land office records, the original deed transfers, the investigators who had already been looking at this for 3 weeks, and had concluded that staying was worse than leaving. "Did he take anything from the ranch?" she said. "Walt's checking. The account books, the ones in the study. Did he?" "Walt locked the study last night," Mrs. Poole said. "After you went to sleep. He didn't say why. I think he had the same thought you're having right now." Clara let out a breath. She said a silent, genuine thank you to Walt Greer and his 11 years of reading this ranch correctly. "Has anyone sent word to Mr. Carter?" she said. "Walt sent a rider at first light." "Good." Clara tied her apron. "Then we make breakfast, and we run this ranch, and we wait." Mrs. Poole looked at her for a moment. "You're not afraid," the older woman said. Not quite a question. "I'm afraid," Clara said. "I'm just not stopping." She made breakfast for 16 men, most of whom had already heard that Bennett was gone and were processing it in the various ways that men on a working ranch process unexpected information, some with silence, some with low conversation that stopped when she came near, some with the direct, practical focus of people who had jobs to do, regardless of what the management situation was doing. Walt Greer came in at 7 and sat at the end of the table and ate. Walt Greer came in at 7 and sat at the end of the table and ate with the deliberate efficiency of a man who had already been working for 3 hours and expected to work for 7 more. He looked at Clara once, across the length of the room. "Study's locked," he said. "I have the key." "Thank you, Mr. Greer." He nodded once and went back to eating. The morning moved in the direction of ordinary. The particular ordinary of a ranch that has had something disrupted and is deciding to keep functioning anyway, because animals needed feeding and fences needed checking, and the work didn't pause for human drama. Clara found a rhythm in it. The kitchen was hers now, in a way it hadn't quite been on day 1. Mrs. Poole working alongside her, rather than parallel to her. Della moving with more confidence. The 3 of them falling into a working pattern that felt less like an arrangement and more like something that had chosen its own shape. She was thinking about her mother. She'd thought about her mother every day. Every morning when the first coffee was made. Every evening when the kitchen lamp was blown out. She'd been sending messages with the supply rider who went through Millhaven. Short notes, practical. Telling her mother the basics of how things stood without burdening her with the full weight of what was happening. Her mother would worry. Her mother would try to do something from a sickbed and make herself worse. So the notes said, "I'm well. The kitchen is running. Rest. What she wanted to say was, I found it, Mama. I found what you saw, and I gave it to someone who could do something about it. You were right. You were right all along, and it wasn't your fault that you couldn't say it louder. She didn't write that. She would say it in person when her mother was well enough to hear it properly. At mid-morning, a rider came in from the direction of Laramie. Not Nathaniel. A younger man she didn't recognize, covered in trail dust, who asked for Walt Greer and was brought to him in the yard. Clara watched from the cookhouse doorway without going out, because it wasn't her place to insert herself into whatever the message was, and because she'd learned in 4 days that waiting for information was sometimes better than chasing it. Walt came to her 20 minutes later. Mr. Carter will be back tomorrow morning, he said. He says the land office has opened a formal investigation. There's a territorial marshal involved now. He paused. He says to tell you, and I'm giving you his exact words, that what you put in writing saved the whole case. Clara leaned against the kitchen doorframe. What did you tell him? She said. Walt looked at her with the expression of a man who did not give compliments easily and was currently wrestling with one. I told him I figured as much, he said. He went back to the yard. Clara went back to the kitchen and stood at the stove and kept her hands moving and let the feeling wash over her and then move on, because there was too much still to do to let herself get overwhelmed by relief yet. Bennett was gone. The investigation was open. Nathaniel was coming back tomorrow. That was the shape of things right now. It was better than yesterday. It was not finished. The day pulled itself forward. At noon, she served the largest midday meal she'd made yet. She'd been planning it since the morning, a proper spread rather than a working day meal, because the men had been working under uncertain authority for 4 days and had done it without complaint, and that deserved something. Beef roasted with what good vegetables remained. Fresh bread. The beans done right with smoked seasoning. Apple pie from the dried fruit in the deep stores, because she'd found the apple crates 2 days ago and had been saving the idea. The cookhouse went quiet when the food came out. The same quiet as the first day. The quiet of people who hadn't expected what they were given. One of the hands, a younger man named Tom, who had been working the ranch for only a year and had the look of someone still figuring out where he stood in the world, looked up from his plate and said, Miss Whitman, this is the best meal I've had since my mother's kitchen. The table laughed. Not unkindly. The easy laugh of men in a room that had relaxed. High praise, Clara said. I mean it sincerely, ma'am. Then thank you sincerely, Tom. Walt Greer, at the end of the table, said nothing. But he took a second piece of pie, which she was coming to understand was Walt's equivalent of a standing ovation. The afternoon brought something she hadn't expected. Sarah Greer came in, not because Clara had asked her, but because Sarah had heard what was happening and had decided on her own to show up, which Clara was learning was very much how Sarah Greer operated. She came in with 2 other women from the neighboring properties. A widow named Mrs. Aldred, who managed 40 acres on her own, and a younger woman named June, who was the wife of one of the ranch hands and had 3 children under 6 at home, but had still found a way to come. They arrived at the kitchen door at 2 in the afternoon, all 3 of them, and Sarah said without preamble, We heard Bennett ran. We came to see if you needed hands. Clara looked at the 3 of them. She thought about all the times her mother had said that the most important resource in any difficult situation was the people who showed up without being asked. Come in, she said. I could use the help. They worked for 2 hours together, the 4 of them in the kitchen, while Mrs. Poole supervised with the authority of a woman who had been running this domain for 7 years and was not about to let standards slip just because there was a crisis. And Della moved between them all like a person who had finally found her right size in a room. They talked while they worked, the ordinary, practical, personal talk of women in a kitchen together, about the ranch and the territory, and the way things worked and didn't work, and the particular difficulties of keeping a household running when the systems supporting it were unreliable. Mrs. Aldred, who was 50 and had been a widow for 8 years, and had the weathered self-possession of a woman who had survived a great deal, said at one point, I've watched this ranch from across the fence line for 4 years. I knew something was wrong with the accounts. My husband, when he was alive, He said Bennett was too smooth. He always said, "Watch out for the smooth ones." "Your husband was right," Clara said. "He usually was, God rest him." Mrs. Aldred was quiet for a moment. "I didn't say anything. I didn't have proof, and I wasn't in a position to make claims against a man with that kind of standing. But I knew." "A lot of people knew," June said quietly. "Or felt it. But feeling isn't the same as knowing, and knowing isn't the same as being able to say it where it counts." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "It counts now," Clara said. Sarah Greer looked at her from across the table with the expression of a woman who had fully made up her mind about something. "You should know," Sarah said, "that my husband thinks Nathaniel Carter is the best man in this territory. Has for 11 years. And Walt does not say that about many people." She paused. "He also said something last night that I want to pass along." "What did he say?" Clara asked. "He said that in 11 years, he has never seen anyone come into this ranch and earn Walt Greer's respect in 4 days." Sarah held her gaze. "He said the last person who came close was Evelyn Whitman, and that took 3 months." Clara set down the dough she was working. She looked at her hands on the kitchen table. She thought about 12 miles on horseback in the July heat, and a door that didn't open, and 4 words that had started all of this. "My mother's going to be embarrassed when I tell her that," she said. The kitchen laughed. And for the first time since she'd ridden out of Millhaven in the dark, Clara laughed with it. A real laugh, warm and full, the kind that lives in your chest and surprises you with how good it feels. Nathaniel Carter rode back into Carter Creek Ranch the next morning at just past 8. Clara knew he was coming before she heard the horse, because Walt Greer had straightened up in the yard 20 minutes before, the way a man straightens when he's expecting his commanding officer, and had positioned himself by the gate with the deliberate patience of someone who has things to report and is ready to report them. She stayed in the kitchen. She had breakfast ready, and the coffee made, and the house clean, and the accounts ledger. The household one, the one she'd been working from. On the kitchen table with her notes beside it, organized and complete and waiting. She heard the horse. She heard Walt's voice, low, and Nathaniel's response, lower. She heard them talking for a while in the yard. She kept working. When Nathaniel Carter came through the kitchen door, she turned around. He looked different from when he'd left. Not older. Tired in a specific way. The way of someone who has spent 2 days in intense, consequential conversations, and has come out the other side of them having done what needed doing. His coat was dusty. He had not shaved, but his eyes were clear, and there was something in his expression that hadn't been there before, something that had been wound very tight for a long time and had now been given permission to ease. He sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, which was the first time he'd done that. Clara poured him coffee and set it in front of him. "Thank you," he said. He wrapped both hands around the cup, the way she'd seen Mrs. Poole do on difficult mornings, and drank and looked at the table for a moment. "The territorial marshal has a warrant for Bennett's arrest," he said. "The land office investigation is formal and complete. The 3 land sellers, the families I thought I'd been paying in full, have been notified that there's a process underway to recover what was taken from them. The deeds are being re-examined. The money that went missing from the transactions." He stopped. "It's recoverable, most of it. It will take time, but it's recoverable." "That's good," Clara said. "Bennett used a false intermediary for the transfers," he said. "A name that doesn't exist on paper, attached to accounts that were his. He'd done this before. The land office in Laramie told me this morning that there are 2 other operations in the territory with similar patterns. He moved here when the last situation got too close to exposure." Clara sat down across from him. "My mother's letter," she said. "Did the land office say?" "It's what started the formal review," Nathaniel said. "They'd had complaints before, but nothing specific enough to act on. Evelyn's letter, the specific numbers she'd noticed, the dates, the categories. That was the first documentation they'd received that gave them something concrete to examine. When I came in with everything else, they already had a framework to put it into." He looked at her. "Your mother built the foundation of this case from a kitchen ledger and a careful pair of eyes. Without her, there was nothing to start from." Clara looked at her hands. She was not going to cry in Nathaniel Carter's kitchen. She absolutely was not going to do that. "She's going to be glad to hear it," she said, very steadily. "How is she?" he said. "The last word I had was that the fever is breaking. The doctor thinks she'll be recovered enough to travel within the week. She'll have a place to come back to," Nathaniel said. "I want to be clear about that. Her position here, it's not just held. I owe her more than I've been paying her, and I intend to correct that." Clara looked up at him. He met her gaze directly, the way she'd noticed he did everything, without flinching, without looking for an easier angle. "And you," he said. She waited. "I made you a conditional offer when you walked through that door," he said. "Show me what you can do. You've shown me considerably more than I asked for." He set the coffee cup down. "I'd like to make you a different offer. Not a trial, not a temporary arrangement. A real position, with real pay, managing the household accounts and supply side of this operation on a permanent basis." Clara held herself very still. "That's my mother's position," she said. "Your mother's position is household manager," he said. "What I'm describing is different. It's the full supply chain, not just the kitchen and the domestic side. The supply ordering, the inventory, the vendor contracts, the record-keeping that interfaces with the ranch accounts. It's a position that didn't exist before because I'd folded it into the manager role and trusted that it was being handled." A pause. "It wasn't being handled. You've shown me in 4 days what it looks like when it is. That's a significant position," she said. "Yes. People will have opinions about a 22-year-old woman in that role." "People have opinions about everything," Nathaniel said. "Their opinions are their own business." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "I'd need to talk to my mother first," she said. "Of course. And I want to be paid what the work is worth. Not what seems appropriate for a woman. What the work is worth." Something moved in his expression. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to respect encountering something it recognized. "Agreed," he said. "And if I find problems in the accounts," she said, "I tell you directly. Not managed, not softened. Directly." "That's what I asked for from the beginning," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted it in the open so we both know that's the arrangement." He extended his hand across the kitchen table. Clara shook it. His handshake was firm and even, the handshake of a man who meant what he'd just said. "Good," he said. Mrs. Poole appeared in the kitchen doorway at that precise moment, looked at the two of them sitting at the kitchen table with their coffee, took in the air of something settled, and said, "Breakfast is getting cold," in the tone of a woman who was not particularly concerned about whether she was interrupting anything. They ate breakfast. The ranch resumed its ordinary rhythm with the specific collective exhale of an operation that has been holding its breath and has now been given permission to breathe. The hands went to their work. Walt disappeared into the day with the purposeful stride of a man who has 11 years' worth of preferred working conditions and is returning to them. Della hummed something in the kitchen. Clara worked. She worked the way she'd been working all week, with complete attention, with the practical focus of someone who understood that a household ran on the 1,000 small decisions made correctly, day after day, and that the only way to make them correctly was to pay attention without stopping. She reorganized the remaining supply records. She began a new inventory system. Not complicated, not fancy, the kind that anyone could maintain because it was built around what people actually did rather than what they were supposed to do. She wrote up a supply order for the coming month that was accurate to what the ranch actually needed, based on what she'd observed, rather than what the previous system had been ordering. She sent the supply order to Nathaniel's study with a note asking him to review it before she sent it out. He sent it back inside the hour with a single line written at the bottom in his even, spare handwriting. "Send it." She sent it. The afternoon brought the visit she'd been both anticipating and dreading. A territorial representative arrived from Laramie. Not the marshal, but a documentation officer, a precise man in his 40s with a leather satchel and the business-like demeanor of someone conducting an official review. He needed access to the ranch's remaining account records, the original supply delivery receipts, the deed paperwork. He needed to verify the household ledger against the supply records she'd documented. He sat at the dining room table with his satchel open and his papers arranged. Nathaniel sat across from him. Clara was asked to join them. She sat at the end of the table and answered the officer's questions with the same directness she'd brought to every conversation this week, because the truth was simple and consistent, and didn't require anything other than a clear memory of what she'd seen and when she'd seen it. She walked him through the supply discrepancies she'd identified, the pattern of the missing inventory, the dates, the specific items, the gap between the ledger records and the actual stores. She answered every question completely and did not guess when she didn't know, and said clearly when something was her interpretation versus something she'd directly observed. The officer wrote everything down. At one point, he looked up from his notes and looked at her with a considering expression. "How long have you been in household accounting, Miss Whitman?" "All my adult life," she said, informally. "And you identified this pattern in—" He checked his notes. "Your first day." "I noticed it the first day. I was certain of the pattern by the end of the second." He looked at his notes again. "The Territorial Land Office," he said, "owes a considerable debt to your mother's letter, and to your documentation." "My mother is the one who saw it first," Clara said. "She saw it," he agreed. "You're the one who said it." He went back to his notes. She sat with that for a moment. "She saw it. You're the one who said it." It was true. And it was the distinction that had cost her the most to make. Not the seeing, not the understanding, but the choosing to speak when speaking meant risking everything she'd come here to protect. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When it was over and the officer had packed his satchel and ridden back toward Laramie, Nathaniel Carter walked him out to his horse and then stood in the yard for a moment. Clara watched from the porch. He turned and looked at her. "I didn't say anything for a moment." Then he said, "There's going to be a formal hearing in Laramie in 3 weeks. You'll need to testify." "I know." "You're comfortable with that?" "I'm not comfortable with it," she said. "I'll do it anyway." He looked at her with that same expression she'd been seeing since the second day, the one that hadn't quite decided what it was, but kept returning. "I'll be there," he said, "for whatever that's worth." "It's worth something," she said honestly. He came back up the porch steps and stopped beside her, and they stood for a moment in the particular quiet of two people who have been through something together and are now standing on the other side of it. "You never asked for help," he said. "This whole week. You found everything yourself. You organized it yourself. You managed the house alone while I was gone. I had Mrs. Poole," she said, "and Della. And Sarah Greer came without being asked. And Walt locked the study, which I didn't know to ask for, and needed more than I knew. You had people because they chose to be behind you," he said. She looked at him. "You should know something," Nathaniel said. He looked at the yard, then back at her, in the manner of someone who has something to say and is saying it carefully but directly. "When you arrived here, when you knocked on that door and said what you said, I expected someone who needed something from me." "I did need something from you," Clara said. "No," he said. "You needed a chance. That's different. What you needed was an open door. Everything after that, everything that happened on the other side of it, that was you." Clara didn't answer immediately. She thought about 12 miles in July heat on an old horse who deserved better. She thought about a bleeding hand and 4 words. She thought about her mother's careful question marks in the margins of a household ledger, and the letter that had gone to the land office 2 months before anyone had read it. "My mother used to say," Clara said, "that a door that opens is only as good as the person willing to walk through it." "Your mother is a wise woman," Nathaniel said. "She is," Clara agreed. "And she's going to be insufferably pleased with herself when she finds out she was right about all of it." Nathaniel Carter made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but had its shape. Clara felt it like something warm. The week continued. 3 days later, a message came from Millhaven. The writer brought it to the kitchen door, and Clara read it standing right there, because she'd learned not to wait to open the things she was afraid of. It was from Mrs. Harding next door. The fever had broken completely. Evelyn Whitman had sat up in bed for the first time, asked for real food, and demanded to know what was happening at Carter Creek Ranch. Clara read the last line twice. "She says you'd better have kept the kitchen in order." Clara folded the note and put it in her pocket. She went back to the stove. She was smiling the way people smile when they're alone, and they can let the smile be as large as it actually is. "Good news?" Della said from behind her. "The best," Clara said. 2 days after that, Evelyn Whitman arrived at Carter Creek Ranch. She came in the supply wagon that made the regular run from Millhaven, not on horseback because she was still recovering and the doctor had been very firm. And she sat on the wagon bench with a blanket over her lap and her back straight and her head up, and the expression of a woman who had been lying in bed for 10 days and was done with it. Clara was at the gate when the wagon came in. They looked at each other. Her mother looked thin, still pale under the summer color she normally carried. But her eyes were sharp and fully present, and she was looking at Clara with the comprehensive, rapid attention of a woman assessing everything at once. "You're still here," Evelyn said. "I told you I would be," Clara said. Her mother climbed down from the wagon, slowly, accepting Clara's hand without comment, which told Clara she was still weaker than she wanted to admit, and stood in the yard of Carter Creek Ranch and looked at the house and the cookhouse and the yard. "The larder," she said. "Reorganized, properly stored, accurate inventory. The accounts. Laramie Land Office has an open investigation, formal hearing in 2 weeks." Evelyn Whitman went very still. "You found it," she said. "We found it," Clara said. "You found it first. I just said it out loud." Her mother looked at her. Clara watched a series of things cross her mother's face in quick succession. Relief, pride, something complicated that might have been grief for the months of worry, and underneath all of it, the quiet, steady love of a woman who had raised her daughter to be exactly the person standing in front of her right now. Evelyn Whitman put her hand on Clara's face. "You kept the kitchen in order?" she said. "Better than you left it," Clara said. Her mother laughed. It was the best sound Clara had heard in 10 days. Nathaniel Carter appeared on the porch. He came down the steps and crossed the yard and stopped in front of Evelyn Whitman and said, with more directness and less ceremony than Clara had expected, "I'm glad you're well, Evelyn, and I owe you an apology." Evelyn looked at him with the calm, measuring expression of a woman who did not rush to accept apologies until she'd heard what they were for. "You sent that letter to Laramie 2 months ago," he said. "You saw something that had been happening under my roof, and you did the right thing about it, and I didn't have systems in place that let you bring it to me directly. That's my failure. I should have been easier to come to." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't sure I had enough," she said. "And a woman in my position—" "I know," he said. "I know what a woman in your position risked by saying something. I know why you went around me to Laramie instead of coming to me directly, and I'm telling you that I intend to change the circumstances that made that necessary." Evelyn Whitman looked at Nathaniel Carter for a long moment. Then she looked at Clara. Clara gave her the smallest shrug that communicated everything. "He means it. He's been like this all week. You'll see." "Then I accept the apology," Evelyn said. "Good," he said. "Come inside. Mrs. Poole has been making enough food to feed half the territory in your honor." He went back up the porch steps. Evelyn Whitman turned to look at Clara. "He's different from how I described him, isn't he?" she said. Not a question. "A little," Clara said. "I may have painted him as more distant than he is." "You painted him accurately for the version you knew," Clara said. "I think the version changed slightly this week." Her mother looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who is seeing something her daughter doesn't quite realize she's letting show. "Clara," she said. "Mama." "Come inside," Evelyn said, and there was something in her voice that was warm and careful and entirely too knowing for Clara to look at directly. She took her mother's arm. They walked up the porch steps of Carter Creek Ranch together, the way they'd walked through every difficult door for the past 10 years, side by side, neither of them stopping. The late afternoon settled over the ranch in the particular golden way of Wyoming summer evenings, warm and long, the light sitting low and heavy over the yard, and the outbuildings, and the paddock where the horses were moving in their easy end-of-day rhythms. Inside the house, Mrs. Poole had done exactly what Nathaniel promised. The kitchen table was loaded with more food than 9 people could reasonably eat, and she was presiding over it with the satisfaction of a woman who had been waiting for a reason to cook properly. Walt Greer came in with Sarah, which was unusual enough that Clara noticed it immediately. Walt at the ranch house table for a meal was not a regular event, and the fact that he was there meant something was being marked. Della came in. The documentation officer from Laramie had sent word that the evidence was complete and the hearing was confirmed. 3 weeks. They sat down together. Nathaniel at the head of the table, Evelyn beside Clara, Mrs. Poole at the other end where she could supervise, Walt and Sarah across from them, Della quiet and content at the corner, and Clara Whitman sat in the kitchen of Carter Creek Ranch and looked around the table at the people who had held this week together, the woman who had raised her, the man who had opened the door, the foreman who had locked the study, the woman who had come without being asked, the housekeeper who had said you raised her right, and understood something she hadn't had words for until this moment. She had come here carrying her mother's letter and 10 years of making impossible situations work. She had not come here to find a place, but she had found one anyway. Not because anyone had given it to her, because she had walked through every difficult door that the week had put in front of her and had not stopped walking, and the place had formed around that. Nathaniel Carter looked at her from across the table. Just looked. The way he'd been looking at her all week, with the focused attention of a man who had stopped taking stock and started simply paying attention. She looked back. She did not look away. Neither did he. And in the warm, busy noise of the table around them, her mother's voice, Mrs. Poole's authority, Walt's low laugh at something Sarah said, something quiet and certain settled between them. Not yet a declaration, not yet even a question, but the kind of recognition that, once it arrives, does not leave. Clara picked up her fork. She ate the best meal she'd had since she rode out of Millhaven in the dark, and Carter Creek Ranch, for the first time in a very long time, felt like exactly what a home was supposed to feel like. Not because it was peaceful, and not because everything was resolved, but because the people around the table were exactly the right people, and every one of them had chosen to be there. The hearing in Laramie was set for a Thursday. They rode out on Wednesday morning. Nathaniel, Clara, Evelyn, and Walt Greer, who had announced the night before that he was coming and had not asked anyone's opinion about it. Sarah had packed food for the road. Mrs. Poole had stayed behind to run the ranch with the particular authority of a woman who had been waiting 7 years for someone to officially hand her the keys. The ride was long and mostly quiet. Evelyn Whitman sat in the wagon with a straightness that cost her more than she admitted, because she was still not fully recovered, and the doctor had said something about waiting another week that she had chosen not to hear. She watched the territory go by and said almost nothing for the first 2 hours, and then said, conversationally, to no one in particular, "I've been thinking about the letter." "Which letter?" Clara said. "The one I sent to Laramie, in May." Evelyn smoothed the blanket across her lap. "I was afraid when I sent it. I was afraid they'd send it back, or ignore it, or, worse, tell Bennett I'd written it. I addressed it to the land office in general because I didn't have a name to put on it. I didn't know if it would reach the right person." "It reached someone," Clara said. "It reached someone who filed it," Evelyn said, "and someone else who read the file, and it sat for weeks before anyone acted on it. And the whole time I was watching Bennett walk through that house like he owned it, and wondering if I'd done the wrong thing by saying anything." She paused. "I've been carrying that since May." "You can put it down now," Clara said. Evelyn looked at her daughter. "I know," she said. "I'm just saying it out loud, so it's said." Nathaniel, riding alongside the wagon, had not appeared to be listening, but he said, without turning, "The people who do the right thing are rarely the ones who get to see it happen in time to feel good about it. That's one of the more unfair arrangements the world runs on." Evelyn considered this. "That's unexpectedly philosophical for 7 in the morning," she said. Nathaniel glanced over. "I've had a philosophical week," he said. Walt Greer, riding on the other side, said nothing. But he made the sound that was his version of quiet agreement, which Clara was now fluent enough to recognize. They arrived in Laramie late that afternoon and took rooms at the boarding house the land office had arranged. The town was larger than Millhaven. More traffic, more permanent buildings, the distinct energy of a place that considered itself significant. Clara had been here twice before, both times as a child with her father, and remembered it as enormous. It seemed smaller now, or she seemed larger. She wasn't sure which. That evening, the territorial investigator came to speak with them at the boarding house. A serious man named Aldous Marsh, mid-40s, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent 20 years looking for things people tried to hide. He went through the hearing procedure with them. What would be asked, what they would be expected to provide, the order in which testimony would be given. He looked at Clara when he was talking about the supply records. "Your documentation," he said, "is the clearest physical evidence we have of the systematic pattern. The land transaction records prove the fraud at the macro level. What you put together from the household accounts proves the methodology, how he operated, what he looked for, how he covered it. Both are necessary. Yours makes the pattern undeniable to people who weren't living inside it." "My mother's records made mine possible," Clara said. "I want that noted in the testimony." "It will be," Marsh said. "Evelyn Whitman's letter is part of the official record. The timeline matters. She identified the problem before any formal investigation began. That's significant." He looked at Evelyn. "You took a considerable risk, Mrs. Whitman," he said, "sending that letter without knowing how it would be received." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "I took a risk," she said. "The alternative was staying quiet about something wrong. That isn't in my nature." Marsh nodded once, with the respect of a man who had heard a great many explanations from a great many people and could tell the difference between the ones that were true. "The hearing begins at 9, he said. "Get some rest." Clara did not get much rest. She lay in the narrow boarding house bed and looked at the ceiling and went through the numbers in her head. Not because she needed to, she knew them completely, but because going through them was what her mind did when it needed to be doing something useful instead of something frightened. She thought about the first morning in the larder, the supply ledger, and the question marks in her mother's handwriting. The moment she'd sat across from Nathaniel Carter and said the words out loud, knowing she couldn't take them back, she thought about what the investigator had said. "Yours makes the pattern undeniable to people who weren't living inside it." She hadn't thought of it in those terms while she was doing it. She'd thought of it as, "Here is what I see, and here is what it means, and someone needs to know." She hadn't thought of herself as building a case. She'd thought of herself as telling the truth, which was something her mother had instilled in her at an age before she could understand why it mattered. The truth had turned out to be enough. She was asleep before midnight and awake before 5, and she got up and got dressed with the deliberate care of a woman who knew that how you carried yourself in a room told people something before you said a word. She wore her best dress, which was still not what wealthy women wore. But it was clean, and it was pressed, and it fit correctly, and she had earned the right to wear it into that hearing room without apology. The hearing was held in the territorial courthouse, a solid building with the permanent air of a place that took its function seriously. There were more people than Clara had expected. Not just the investigator and the land office officials, but the 3 land sellers whose transactions had been manipulated, each of them with their own legal representatives. 2 other ranch operators from the territory who had been affected by Bennett's previous scheme. A court reporter, 2 officials from the territorial governor's office, and Charles Bennett, brought in by the marshal, looking nothing like the smooth, careful man who had appeared in the larder doorway 4 days into Clara's time at Carter Creek Ranch. He looked like a man who had spent 2 weeks running and had been caught and was now sitting with the particular stillness of someone who understood that stillness was his last remaining option. He looked at Clara when she came in. She looked back at him. She sat down. The hearing began. Nathaniel testified first. The land transactions, the authorized payments, the gap between what he'd believed he was paying and what the sellers had actually received. He spoke clearly and without embellishment, the way a man speaks when he knows the facts are sufficient and decoration would only get in the way. Bennett's representative tried twice to suggest that the discrepancies could be attributed to normal transfer delays and fee variations common in territorial land transactions. Nathaniel said quietly, I've been making land transactions in this territory for 15 years. I know what normal variation looks like. The representative did not try a third time. Evelyn testified second. She walked to the chair at the front of the room with the erect posture of a woman who was still recovering from illness and absolutely refused to let that be visible, and she sat and answered every question with the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had been keeping accounts for 30 years and understood that accuracy was its own authority. She described the household supply discrepancies. She described what she had noticed and when. She described the letter to Laramie, why she'd written it, what she'd included, why she'd addressed it the way she had. She described the question marks in her ledger margins and what each one represented. At one point, Bennett's representative said, "Mrs. Whitman, you are a household manager, not an accountant. Is it possible that what you interpreted as discrepancies were simply, 'I have been managing household accounts since I was 18 years old,'" Evelyn said. Her voice was perfectly level. "I know the difference between a discrepancy and a misunderstanding. What I documented in that ledger was a discrepancy." The representative paused. "And when you wrote to the land office?" "I wrote to the land office because I had seen something wrong, and I did not have the authority within my position to address it directly," Evelyn said. "So I used the authority I did have, my name, my observations, and the postal system, and I sent the information to people whose job it was to act on it." Silence. "That's all," Evelyn said. Clara watched her mother walk back to her seat and thought, "There it is. There is exactly where I come from." Then it was Clara's turn. She walked to the front of the room, and she did not look at Bennett, and she did not look at the representatives, and she sat in the chair and looked at Aldous Marsh, because he was the person who would ask the questions, and the rest of the room could watch. Marsh walked her through the documentation she'd prepared. The supply records, the inventory comparison, the pattern analysis, the dates and amounts and categories. She answered every question with the same direct clarity she'd brought to every difficult conversation this week. She didn't guess. She didn't embellish. When she wasn't certain, she said so, and when she was certain, she said that too. Bennett's representative tried. "Miss Whitman, you had been at Carter Creek Ranch for—" He checked his notes in a way that was meant to suggest the number was so small as to be absurd. "Less than 48 hours when you claim to have identified this pattern." "I identified the beginning of the pattern in the first 2 hours," Clara said. "It took me until the end of the second day to be certain it was a pattern rather than disorganization." "And you arrived at Carter Creek Ranch under what circumstances exactly?" Clara looked at him. "My mother was ill," she said. "She managed the household for Mr. Carter. I came to do her work while she recovered." "So you were in an uncertain employment situation, desperate to prove your value." "I was doing my job," Clara said. "Part of my job was accurate inventory. When inventory doesn't match records, that's a problem. I documented the problem. That's what a person who is doing their job does." The representative paused. "You had reason," he said carefully, "to want to appear indispensable." "Every person in and every employment has reason to do good work," Clara said. "That's not a motive for fabrication. That's a description of employment." Somewhere behind her, she heard a sound that might, from Walt Greer, have constituted a suppressed laugh. The representative looked at his papers. "Nothing further," he said. Marsh stood. "Miss Whitman," he said, "I have one final question. When you decided to bring your findings to Mr. Carter, knowing that you had been at the ranch less than 2 days, knowing you had an uncertain position, knowing that the person your findings implicated had been there 4 years, what made you do it?" Clara looked at him. She thought about the right answer versus the true answer. And then she thought about what her mother had said about saying things out loud, so they were said. "Because someone had done something wrong," she said. "And I was in a position to say so. And the only reason not to say so was fear of what it would cost me." She paused. "I decided that wasn't a good enough reason." The room was quiet. "Thank you, Miss Whitman," Marsh said. "That's all." She walked back to her seat. Nathaniel was looking at her. She sat down. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The expression on his face said it in a language that didn't need words. The hearing concluded at midday. Bennett's representative made his final arguments. Careful, procedural, doing the best available work with unavailable material. The land office officials conferred. The court reporter gathered her pages. At 1:30, the Territorial Land Commissioner read the findings. Charles Bennett had conducted systematic fraud against Carter Creek Ranch and 2 prior operations in the territory. The amount misappropriated from Nathaniel Carter across the supply accounts and land transactions was documented and would be subject to recovery proceedings. The land transactions themselves were being reviewed for full restitution to the 3 sellers. Criminal charges had been filed. Bennett was escorted out by the marshal. He looked at nothing and no one on the way out. The 3 land sellers, a widow named Mrs. Kowalski, an older farmer named Garrett, and a young couple named the Brennans, who had sold their parcel under genuine financial pressure, were told that recovery proceedings would begin within 60 days. Mrs. Kowalski, who had been sitting in the back of the room with her hands folded in her lap for the entire hearing, stood when it was over and walked directly to Evelyn Whitman. "Your letter," she said, "to the land office." Evelyn looked at her. "Your letter is what started this," Mrs. Kowalski said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "I was told there was nothing that could be done. I was told these things happen, and there's no proving it. Your letter proved it." She stopped. "I've been fighting this for a year. I couldn't afford a lawyer. I couldn't—" She stopped again. Evelyn stood up and took the woman's hands in hers. "You don't need to say anything else," Evelyn said. "I do," Mrs. Kowalski said. "Because nobody told me someone was looking. For a year I thought I was alone in it. I want you to know that it mattered. That you writing that letter when you didn't have to, it mattered more than I can tell you." The 2 women stood holding hands in the courthouse hallway, and Clara stood a few feet away and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would add to what was already there. Nathaniel came to stand beside her. They watched in silence. "She'll think about that conversation for the rest of her life," Nathaniel said quietly. "So will my mother," Clara said. He was quiet for a moment. "Come on," he said. "Let's go home." The ride back to Carter Creek Ranch was different from the ride out. The weight was different. Something had been set down that all of them had been carrying without fully acknowledging. The uncertainty of whether it would be enough, whether the truth they'd spent a week building would be sufficient when it stood in an official room in front of people with the authority to decide. It had been sufficient. More than sufficient. And the releasing of that particular held breath changed the quality of the air. Evelyn fell asleep in the wagon an hour out of Laramie, which she would never have admitted to if she'd been awake, and Walt took the reins without being asked and drove with the easy competence of a man who had been doing useful things his entire life and found it as natural as breathing. Clara rode alongside. Nathaniel rode alongside her. They rode in comfortable quiet for a long time. "What you said in there," he said finally. "At the end." "Which part?" "The only reason not to say so was fear of what it would cost me. I decided that wasn't a good enough reason." He paused. "I've been thinking about that." "It's just the truth," she said. "Most people know the truth," he said. "Not everyone says it in a room full of people who have reason to want them wrong." Clara looked at the road ahead. "I had help," she said. "My mother built the foundation. Walt locked the study. Sarah came without being asked. Mrs. Poole, she covered for me in ways I didn't realize until later." She paused. "I didn't do it alone." "No," he said. "But you're the one who walked through the door." She turned and looked at him. Howe was looking at her with the direct attention that she'd come to recognize as his most honest mode. Not the measured consideration of a man assessing, but the simpler, more open attention of a man who had stopped calculating and was just looking. "I'd like to talk to you about something," he said. "When we're back, when things are settled." "All right," she said. "Not about the ranch, not about the position." She held his gaze. "All right," she said again, more quietly. He looked back at the road. She looked back at the road. But the feeling that had been building all week, the one she'd been careful not to name, the one she'd set aside every time it tried to surface, because there had always been something more urgent, more practical, more important to handle. That feeling had somewhere in the last 60 seconds decided it was done being set aside. She didn't fight it. She let it be what it was, and rode. The weeks that followed the hearing moved in the direction of the life that comes after the crisis. Full, practical, demanding. Full of the ordinary beautiful work of making something run correctly. Clara's position was formalized. She was given access to the full ranch accounts and spent 3 weeks rebuilding the supply system from the ground up, creating a record-keeping structure that was transparent and auditable, and built around the reality of what people actually did, rather than what a single person claimed was being done. She brought in Mrs. Aldred from the neighboring property to help establish the new vendor relationships, because Mrs. Aldred had been managing her own operation for 8 years, and had contacts and practical knowledge that Clara needed and was not too proud to ask for. The 3 land sellers got their recovery proceedings. Mrs. Kowalski's was the first complete. 63 days after the hearing, she received a bank draft for the full amount she was owed. She sent a note to Evelyn Whitman that said only, "It came. Thank you." Evelyn kept the note in the front of her household ledger. The ranch grew. Not dramatically. Not in the sudden expansive way that comes from a lucky season or an exceptional deal, but in the steady compounding way of an operation where everything is tracked correctly, and waste is eliminated, and people are treated as worth their work. 3 of the ranch families who had been affected by Bennett's previous schemes in the territory, families who had sold land they shouldn't have had to sell, were connected through Mrs. Aldred to a legal office in Cheyenne that was pursuing recovery for them. Nathaniel funded the legal fees. He did it without announcement, and Clara knew about it only because she saw it in the accounts, and when she mentioned it he said simply, "It's right," and moved on, which was the way he handled most things that were right. She found, over those weeks, that she understood him more completely than she had expected to understand any person this quickly. Not because he was uncomplicated. He was not uncomplicated. He was a man who had built something significant alone, and had spent so long alone in the building of it that he'd partly forgotten how to be in the same direction as another person. He was sometimes more inside his own thinking than outside in the conversation. He occasionally made decisions without explaining them, and then looked genuinely surprised when she wanted the explanation. She told him once directly, "I need to know the reasoning, not just the outcome. If we're working this ranch together, I need to understand how you think." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said, and he started explaining his reasoning. It was, she noticed, very good reasoning. She disagreed with it about a third of the time, and said so, and he listened when she did. Not always agreeing, but always actually listening, in the way of someone who had decided that disagreement was more useful than compliance. That made him, in her estimation, considerably rarer than she'd known how to look for before. One evening in late September, when the summer heat had finally relented and the Wyoming territory was moving into its brief, beautiful autumn, Nathaniel came to the kitchen at the end of the day. Not at dinner time. Not at the practical business end of the day. Later, when Mrs. Poole had gone to her room and Della was long home and the kitchen was clean and quiet and just Clara at the table with the account book she'd been working through. He sat down across from her. I didn't say anything for a moment, which was, she'd learned, how he began things that mattered to him. "I've been thinking about what I said on the ride back from Laramie," he said. "I know," she said. "I said I wanted to talk to you, not about the ranch." "I remember. I've been—" He stopped, looked at his hands on the table. "I have not been very good at this part of things, the part that isn't the ranch. I've spent a long time being good at the ranch and not thinking much about the rest of it, because the ranch was enough to occupy a person completely, and I let it." "I know," she said again, gently. He looked up at her. "When you rode through that gate," he said, "I thought I knew exactly what I was looking at. A young woman in a difficult situation asking for something she needed. And I gave her the conditional thing. Show me what you can do. Because that's the way I operate. That's the way this ranch runs. You earn what you get, and nothing is given ahead of the earning." "It's not a bad way to operate," Clara said. "It's not," he agreed. "But what I didn't account for—" He paused again, in the careful way of someone who is finding their way toward something precise. Was that I would watch someone spend a week doing things that cost her something, at every point, and choose to do them anyway. And that watching that would change something. Clara set down her pencil. She looked at him. I'm not good at the language of this, he said. I want to be honest about that up front. I'm not a man who... He stopped. Tried again. The ranch is mine because I built it. I understand how to build things. People are... This is... He made a gesture with one hand that was not quite frustration and not quite helplessness, but somewhere between the two. This is harder than the ranch. Clara felt something move through her that was warm and specific and could not be set aside even if she'd wanted to. Nathaniel, she said. He looked at her. You're doing fine, she said. Something that had been tight in his face eased. I want to court you properly, he said. I want to do it right. Not because of the ranch, not because of what you've brought to this operation, though you've brought more than I can calculate, because of what I've watched you be this whole time, because of who you actually are. He stopped. I didn't know a person could be all of that at once. I didn't know to look for it until I watched it happen. Clara sat with that for a moment. She thought about 12 miles on horseback in July heat. She thought about a bleeding hand and 4 words. She thought about her mother's question marks in the margins of a ledger and a letter to a land office, and the particular way courage looked when it didn't announce itself, when it just got up and went to work and didn't stop until the thing was done. She thought about a man who had opened a door to a stranger and had said, "Show me what you can do," and had meant it, and had looked at what she showed him and had not looked away. I want that too, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then the thing that had been living almost a smile on his face for 2 months finally arrived, warm and genuine and slightly surprised by itself. The smile of a man who had not expected to arrive here and was glad he had. Good, he said. You should probably talk to my mother, Clara said. I already did, he said. This morning. Clara blinked. What did she say? She said, and I am giving you her exact words, about time. Clara pressed her lips together. She lasted approximately 2 seconds before she laughed. The same warm, full laugh she'd given to Sarah Greer's kitchen. The kind that surprised her with its size. Nathaniel Carter watched her laugh with the expression of a man who had spent 20 years building a ranch that was worth something, and had just now realized for the first time that he had also, without planning for it, without knowing how to go about it, built something worth considerably more. The autumn moved through Carter Creek Ranch like a long exhale. The formal hearing results brought changes that spread beyond the ranch itself. The Territorial Land Commissioner's Office issued new protocols for transaction documentation, specific requirements that Aldous Marsh had apparently pushed for directly, citing the Carter Creek case as a model of how systematic fraud evaded detection when oversight was fragmented. Clara's documentation methods were referenced in the protocol language, which she only discovered because Marsh sent a copy of the new protocols to Nathaniel with a note that said the design of the new supply verification system was modeled on her inventory methodology. She read the note twice. She put it in the front of the new account ledger she'd started. Her mother saw it there one morning and read it and looked at Clara and said nothing. But her expression said everything that needed to be said. Mrs. Aldred started bringing her own ledger to the ranch twice a month, because she and Clara had begun what Clara thought of privately as an informal accounting cooperative, a way of sharing methods and records between neighboring operations that gave each of them more complete information about the territory's supply networks and pricing than any one of them could develop alone. Mrs. Kowalski joined eventually. Then the Brennan couple, who had recovered their land settlement and were rebuilding. It was not a formal organization. It had no name. It was just women who had learned to keep accurate records sitting together and making each other more accurate. Nathaniel called it the most useful thing that had happened to the territory's ranching community in 10 years. Mrs. Poole called it common sense. Walt Greer called it nothing, but Sarah told Clara privately that he'd told her it was the most sensible arrangement he'd seen in his entire professional life, which from Walt was essentially a civic honor. On an evening in late October, the first cold evening of the season, Clara was sitting on the porch steps of the main house when Nathaniel came out and sat beside her. They sat in the particular comfortable quiet that had developed between them over the months. The quiet of two people who had talked enough to earn the silences, who didn't fill them unnecessarily, who were confident enough in each other's presence to let the evening simply be the evening. After a while he said, "Do you remember what you said to me when you arrived?" "I've said a number of things to you since I arrived," she said. "The first thing, at the door." She looked at the yard. "My mother is sick," she said. "So I came." "I've thought about those 4 words more than I can account for," he said. There's everything in them. Everything that you are." Clara looked at him. "It was the truth," she said. "It was just the simplest version of what was happening." "That's what I mean," he said. "You didn't dress it up. You didn't make it into a case for why I should let you in. You just said what was true, and you stood there and you let it be enough." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know if it would be enough," she said honestly. "I hoped it would be." "It was," he said. "It was more than enough." He reached over and took her hand on the step between them. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, the same way he did everything that mattered to him. Directly, without apology, as if he'd simply decided it was the right thing and was doing it. She let her hand stay in his. The ranch settled around them into evening. The horses in the paddock, the last light over the outbuildings, the faint sound of Mrs. Poole saying something firm to Della about the dinner service, which suggested everything was exactly as it should be inside. Clara Whitman had ridden to Carter Creek Ranch in July with an old horse and a worn dress and her mother's letter, and no certainty of anything except that she was going to try. She had not come looking for this. She had not come looking for any of it. Not the position, not the hearing, not the accounting cooperative, not the woman in the courthouse hall holding her mother's hands, not the man sitting beside her right now on the porch steps with the honest, unhurried solidity of someone who had decided. She had come because her mother was sick and someone had to, and the only person there was to go had been her. But the life that was built in the going, built out of accuracy and honesty and the willingness to walk through difficult doors and say true things in rooms full of people who had reasons to want her wrong, that life had become something she would not have traded for anything the world had on offer. Her mother came out of the house behind them, wrapped in a shawl against the October evening, and looked at the two of them on the steps with the expression of a woman who is seeing exactly what she expected to see and is precisely as pleased about it as she'd anticipated. "Dinner," Evelyn said. "We're coming," Clara said. Evelyn went back inside. Clara looked at Nathaniel. He looked at her. "Ready?" he said. She stood up and reached back for his hand, the same way she'd reached for her mother's hand, going up these very steps in August, because some doors you walked through differently when you didn't walk through them alone. He stood. He took her hand. They went inside. And Carter Creek Ranch, which had been many things in its years, a cattle operation, a fraud, a battlefield, a recovery, a home, became, on that October evening, exactly what it was always capable of being, in the hands of people who were willing to do the honest work of making it so. A woman had ridden 12 miles in the July heat with nothing but the truth and the courage to say it. That had been enough.